So today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on higher order components, and hopefully by the end of it you get a better understanding on why it's needed, the best way to use it, and why it's a really useful tool in the world of React. I think this will be a really good way to intro you into higher order components. So let's just take a step back and talk about why higher order components are important. And in a nutshell, higher order components are really useful and important because it abstracts code away from components that are using the same exact code. So it's essentially solving the problem to where when you have different components that are using shared code, and it's making your code a lot less maintainable and a lot less scalable. And higher order components is a really good way to tackle that. Really useful tool in React. So what we're going to do is get into it with a really simple example. And I already have some boilerplate code here, but we're essentially starting from scratch. So let's just talk about how we're going to showcase the usefulness of higher order components. So we have 3 counters here. Really what they're going to render are buttons, and each button is going to have a corresponding counter within it, handled by its state. And the idea is that whenever you click on the button, the counter is going to go up. And all 3 of these components are going to have this same shared code. And we're going to use higher order component. We're going to use a higher order component to abstract the code away and make it a lot more simple in general. So let's go ahead and get into it. So let's first take a look at counter 1. There's no code here. So let's go ahead and start off with importing React from React. And cool. And let's just say class counter 1 extends React dot component. And let's go ahead and do constructor here. Constructor's gonna have props, and then we need our super here. Props. And before we move forward, let's go ahead and export default counter 1. Cool. And let's look at what our render here. And so what are we rendering? Well, like I said before, we are rendering a button. And let's just call this one counter 1. And let's go ahead and see if this renders to the screen. And we're going to also copy and paste this code into the counter 2 and counter 3 components. And let's actually just change the name of the components here, just to make sure you know where we're at with things. Make it consistent. And I'm expecting all 3 counters to render to the screen. Let's see if that works. And it didn't, and I believe it's because let's see what the error is here. Counter 1 is not defined. Okay, so probably something we're doing wrong here. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's probably what the issue is. Cool. So we got counter 1, counter 2, and counter 3 here. And let's go ahead and implement the functionality that I was talking about in terms of clicking on the button and making the count go up for the counter. So let's start off actually by looking at what our state is. So state We have our this.state here, and we have a key value pair, and we're going to initialize count at 0. And then let's go ahead and use a method here and call it increase count actually. And this is just gonna be pretty simple here. So this dot state dot count plus plus this dot set state, and then we're going to use the state that we just, the count that we just incremented, and put that as the new count inside the state. And let's make sure that that's represented in the browser, in the UI. So this dot state dot count, and let's just see if this works for this counter1 component. Not working. Okay, it's not working. I think it's because we do not have a on-click event handler. Just dot increase count. Let's see if that works. All right, that's working. Cool. So now let's actually go ahead and copy and paste all of this code into counter 2 and counter 3. Let's go ahead and do that. Counter 3 and counter 3. All right, let's see if we got the same functionality with the other components. Got it for counter 1, got it for counter 2, and got it for counter 3. Cool. All right, so now let's take a step back and look at this really quick. So counter 1, counter 2, and counter 3 all have the same code. They're all implemented the same way. There's an increase count method. There's the state is keeping track of the count, and essentially they're all three components using the same code. So what higher order components allow us to actually do is abstract that code into the higher order component, and then when we need it, when we need the state and we need the methods, we can just call on that higher order component, and it takes care of infusing those components with the state and the methods that we need. So let's go ahead and take a look at how to actually implement this higher order component. So I already created a file called withcounter.js, and this is where our higher order component lives. This is our higher order component. So let's go ahead and implement it and see what it looks like. So we're going to just say import React from React, like we always do. And then we're going to go ahead and create actually it's going to be a stateless functional component. So we're going to call it const with counter equals const with counter, and actually let's just it's going to be one input, so let's just call it wrapped component, because it's going to be a component that we're going to wrap with some props. And let's go ahead and implement it that way. And so okay, so at this point what happens? Actually, let's go ahead and export default just before we forget about that. Default with counter, that's what we're going to be exporting at the end of the day. So inside this higher order component, we're going to do some things to manipulate whatever component that we pass into this component. Again, so a higher order component is just a component that takes another component, does some stuff to it in terms of gives it some props, and then spits it back out and returns it. So let's go ahead and create a React component called with counter as well, but this is actually going to be a React stateful component, and this is eventually going to be what we're going to return, but let's go ahead and implement it. So class with counter with an uppercase W extends react.component. Let's go ahead and do that, and then we're going to do the standard, not that yet, standard here with the constructor. Super props, and again, so this is essentially the code that we were implementing in the other three components. This is where the abstraction comes into place. And let's go into our render, and what are we going to render? So here is where it differs a little bit, because this is actually going to be, we're going to be actually returning the wrapped component. But we're going to be giving it some props. And the props is going to be, number one is going to be the count. So this dot state dot count. And then we haven't implemented it yet, but it's going to be the increase count method. Increase count. Let's go ahead and implement that increase count. But actually, you know what? We're just gonna go ahead and, we've already written that code, so let's go ahead and just take that and just copy and paste it there. Cool. And at the very end of this with counter component, we want to actually return this React component with counter, right? Cool. So this is essentially how you implement your higher order component. And let's go ahead and see how we utilize it. So let's go back to counter one, and let's go ahead and import with counter from with counter, right? And at this point, we can actually go ahead and make a few changes here. So at this point, we're not actually going to be needing this to be a stateful component anymore, because state is being handled in the with counter higher order component, and the method is also being handled there as well. But we can go ahead and just turn this into a, and I'll erase that at the bottom, but let's go ahead and just turn this into a stateless component. So equals right, and then let's return, let's go ahead and return this button here. Turn this button. Pop-up warning there. Oh, it still did not copy to the clipboard. Let's make sure that does that this time. Cool. So that, a little bit of an error here. Let's see how it's implemented. Oh, I'm using the wrong syntax there. Forgive me. Cool. So that's actually what we're going to be returning now. So that's, we just simplified that that component. And at this point, we can get rid of the this keyword here and get rid of the this.state there. And you might be wondering at this point, all right, well, how are we going to access those variables? And those variables actually are going to come in the props now for counter 1. And we get those props by passing this counter into our higher order component. And we can go ahead and use deconstruction to get both of those tools that we need, being the increase count method and the count from the state in the higher order component. And we'll do it like that. Cool. So if everything is working out like we think it's supposed to be working out, counter 1 should still be counting up. And let's see if that's actually the case here. So cannot read props of undefined. Cannot read props. Oh, my bad. Still needs that. Cannot read props of undefined. Let's see what's going on here. Props. This dot props. Not read props of. Oh, you know what? That's my bad. In order, actually, you know what? We can just do props like that. Actually, yeah, there we go. Yeah, we didn't need to use the this dot prop, this keyword there. All right, let's see if counter 1 works. Awesome. Looks like it's working. Cool. So we just got rid of a lot of things that we didn't need. We got rid of all that functionality in terms of the method that we were using and the state that we were keeping track of, because that's being taken care of in the higher order component. So let's go ahead and copy and paste all of this code into counter 1, counter 2, and counter 3. And look at that. It's like a lot less code. And this is just a really simple example. Let's go here. Same thing. Counter 3. And counter 3. Now let's go ahead and make sure that's all 3 components are working. Yep. All right. Sweet. All 3 are working. So that's how you implement a higher order component. Let's just talk about 2 more things before we end this tutorial. One thing, let's try out something. Let's pass a prop into counter 1. Let's just call it name. And my name is Chike, so just pass that in. And let's say we wanted to render my name, like right before this count right here, this counter 1 text, and just say this, or just say props dot name, and let's see if anything renders to the screen. And nothing renders. Well, why is that? Well, that is because that props, now that we're using a higher order component, those props are actually being passed into our with counter component, our with counter higher order component, and we need to use this nifty little tool in order to get any props that we are missing, that we didn't explicitly name here with our count and increase count. So now it should come over. That's something that you got to be really careful of, because that's the only way to get those props to come down. So let's see if that actually works. And it looks like it does work. Cool. Chike is now there. Another thing I wanted to talk about is, let's say that we wanted to pass an input other than the component into the higher order component. And let's say we want to do that. The way to do that is to take a second argument here. Let's just call it number. Let's call it number. And let's look at counter 2 actually. Let's look at counter 2. And at this point, let's say we wanted to actually let's take a step back. So we're going to be passing in a number argument in here, and let's say we wanted to increment by that number instead of by 1. So whatever number we pass into the higher order component. So now we would go back to, let's say, counter 2, and let's say we wanted counter 2 to increment by 5, just by 5 instead of by 1. This is essentially how you would implement it. So let's go as a counter 2 and see if that's working. And it looks like that is working. Counter 2 is now incrementing by 5. Cool. So that is my tutorial on higher order components. Hopefully that helped you understand why they're important, what they're useful for, and thanks for listening. Until next time.